All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the fourth in our series of anti-racism discussions based on different books and videos. I am going to be talking this evening about Raising White Kids by Dr. Jennifer Harvey. And I think it's a really great book, not just for parents and grandparents and those who work with children, but for people of all ages. I think that it will be an opportunity to continue to build a bridge between theology and sort of practical things that we can do. So I think many of you know me. I am Christine Hides. I serve as the Director of Christian Education at Kenilworth Union. Something you may not know about me is that I am a deacon in the United Methodist Church, and part of my call to ordained ministry is deeply rooted in justice and compassion, and specifically some of the work that I did early in my career working with Chicago Public Schools. So I'm happy to talk about that more another time, but just so you know that this is a topic that speaks to my heart and is part of my call to ministry. So thank you for being here. And I also want to say thank you to Carolyn Raitt. She has been my conversation partner for the past few weeks as we talked about how to frame this discussion. It's a rich and meaty book, so we can't talk about everything. But Carolyn is, I hope I'm getting this right, a licensed professional counselor. And so her mental health expertise and understanding of psychology is, she's going to contribute a little bit, a piece of that in a few moments. So thank you, Carolyn, for being here with us.
You're welcome. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks. So I am going to ask, let's see, there we go. Can we all see the screen? Yes, okay. So I'm going to ask Katie if you would please share this as by way of a blessing and a prayer this evening. I'm going to use this reflection that is by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. And if you are not familiar with her, please look her up. She is doing some fantastic work as a justice doula. So if you want to learn more about that, she's all over the internet. So Katie, would you please open us in prayer?
Sure. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side.
Thank you, Katie. May these words and the brave space we create tonight serve as our prayer. Amen. So this is Rev Dr Jennifer Harvey, and she serves as a professor of religion at Drake University, and she is also ordained in the American Baptist churches. And she has written several books, and a few of them speak more about faith and more to a church audience. But Raising White Kids has been one that I have heard her speak on and have read a few times, so I selected it this evening. This book was born out of her experience, both as a scholar and as a parent, and also as a teacher of young college students. And she also lives very near Ferguson. So this book sort of came together about all of those things. And one of the things that she experiences as a teacher of young adults is that they come often to college with a limited ability to speak about race and issues of race in our country. And she believes that much of that is maybe because of this idea of colorblindness, and that we might be teaching our children to be colorblind, which results in what she calls one-dimensional conversations. So an example of this would be what we want our children to hear, perhaps, and maybe what we say but they don't always fully hear, is that we should all be equal, we all have equal worth, but we don't all yet experience equality. That's sort of a nuanced understanding of equality and race. But often the message gets boiled down to this one-dimensional, we are all equal. And if you come to college and that is your kind of understanding of the world, that we are all equal, and then you experience something different and you don't have the language and the vocabulary to talk about race, it can be very challenging. So this book really talks about how parents can engage in race conscious parenting, so that children can grow into people who have more ability to discuss race and racial issues. And this is important because even young children have develop understandings of race based on their experience. So this image, which is probably, I won't go into detail in it, and you can look it up. It's from the Children's Community School, but it touches on some of the research about how children develop an understanding of race. So by kindergarten, it says children show many of the same racial attitudes that adults in our culture have, and they've already learned to associate some groups with higher status than others. And I should point out that this is, I think that particular statement is more about white kids, but there are some other statements in here as well. So our kids are developing an understanding of race, whether or not we are explicitly teaching about race or not. That is part of human development. And she compares and understands racial development as being very similar to physical, intellectual, and emotional development, that all humans are growing and developing throughout our lifetime, and children develop regardless of what kind of attention you pay to that particular thing. But as parents, many of us, or grandparents, if we think about physical development, we don't just feed our kids Frosted Flakes. This is Dr. Harvey's example. We give them a well-balanced diet because we understand that that's essential to their healthy growth and development. And so in the same way, we need to have conversations and parenting strategies that are more than Frosted Flakes when we talk about racial identity development, especially white racial identity development. And what I really like about this is that it's not just for children. I think that we're all here because we have a common understanding that as human beings, we can grow and evolve and develop throughout our lifetime, that this is a journey. So we'll go through some of the racial identity stages, and I think that we'll find they're not just for kids, they're for adults too. So I wanted to just pause here and see if you all, does this resonate with you? Is this this understanding of racial identity as being a developmental process, is that familiar, or is that somewhat new to you?
I think it's new. It isn't something that we've grown up with, and I think it's all much of it has come to the surface in this last year. And it's about time, but I don't think we really thought about it that much.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful to know kind of if it, where people have heard. And yes, it has come to light. Dr. Harvey does a lot of speaking appearances. You'll see her on NBC and all kinds of places when there's a racialized incident incidents in our country, she is often in those interviews, NPR, kind of all over, Good Morning America. She is called to speak about how do you talk to kids about race when there's these news stories that our children, end up seeing, and how do we talk to them? Well, thank you. So the core question of her book is, what does then a healthy white kid look like? And I think that this is where we really bridge sort of our beliefs with action. And again, it's not just about children, it's about what does a healthy white person look like in terms of a racial identity. And the answer isn't simple. It's it's complicated, and she does a lot of work unpacking the nuance around particularly the way that white people are in what she calls a vexed location, where we simultaneously both experience privilege and then also are challenged to work against it. That can be really challenging and is a vexed location. But in the beginning of her book, she talks about white children or white humans being comfortable in our own skin and able to function in racially diverse environments, and not being colorblind, but not making assumptions about people based on their race either. And I think the third point is really important, and I think speaks to the sort of the conversations and the work that we've been doing in this group, is about having that strong moral foundation and equipping ourselves to interrupt racism, both as we see it in our individual lives and then think about interrupting the systems of racism that we encounter. So I think that gives us a vision of what sort of healthy white racial identity development might look like. And so then the goal, like with any human development process, is to maximize the positive impact while understanding that we're in a really difficult context, where we've talked in this group about the segregation and division and the ways in which white people are part of systems of injustice that we, it's very difficult to untangle ourselves from. We were born into them. So that would be sort of the goal of this book. So I'll pause here for just a moment and see if there are any thoughts so far. Does this sound like a healthy, do you agree with this goal? Is this of healthy white racial identity development? Thoughts or perspectives?
Well, I'll jump in here. At age 83, it's a new paradigm of a way to think about things. So I'm one of those guys says, I'm not racist because, in college, I went out and worked for the New York City Mission Society. I worked at camps for underprivileged kids in New York City. I had good friends, Black friends who were counselors, etc. Over the years, we lost track because my Christmas cards would come back, that sort of thing. So, it's, yes, I mean, we have to sort of rethink, not in a defensive way, the things that we've taken for granted, that one, we should have taken for granted. So this is a moment in time where it's a tremendous opportunity for white people to understand the seriousness of the problem that we just didn't really acknowledge.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, John. And we're going to get into that process in a minute, and get into that process of what it looks like to realize that things that we didn't realize before, that maybe were in front of us, but we didn't have the language or the experience, or we just maybe didn't know or weren't aware. So we're going to get into sort of the process of how that new understanding comes about. And this is where I invited Carolyn in. To talk about white racial identity development theory And there are sort of two people who did that. So Carolyn, could you just speak a little bit about where the stages I'm going to share come from and how they came about?
Absolutely, Christine. And before I speak to that, one thing I want to add that that Harvey talks about is this, with her metaphor of feeding your kids Frosted Flakes. Like, we all know that that is not a fully nutritious, adequate, well-balanced diet. And so she talks about how, like, if you're raising a kid, you know that Frosted Flakes are not all they should eat. You know that they need more and different foods in addition to Frosted Flakes. You're not sure necessarily offhand what they are. So you, as a good parent, go out, do some research, learn about nutrition, learn about child development. And that's what we're doing in this study group, looking at white racial identity development so that we can raise healthy white kids. And there's no shame in not knowing this, because this is stuff that most of us weren't taught in school, because these models are newer. And so this is necessary work, and I just want to applaud everyone for being here. So in terms of models of racial identity development, initially folks started looking at racial identity development among people of color. So Black, Brown, Latinx folks, Asian folks. And initially there was a very colorblind approach to looking at racial identity development among white people, because white isn't a race, or so people thought. And then folks realized that actually, like, one, these models of racial identity development that we've been looking at, that we thought really, that we developed for people of color, they don't fit for white individuals. Also, white individuals' development is qualitatively different because they are, in virtually all societies, white folks are the privileged group in the social hierarchy. And so what happened in the research is, and the scholarship, is that identity development scholars realized that there needs to be a different model of identity development for white people than there is for people of color. And so this model draws on other theories of racial identity development, but really is unique to white people, because we have a very different position in society. And as Christine said earlier, as Harvey says, it's a vexed position. It's not an easy position. Not that people of color have an easy position, but they're both challenging in their own unique ways.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that, because I think when I took a psychology class way back in the day, maybe more than one, but I don't remember us talking about this. So it is relatively newer. So thank you, Carolyn, for sharing some of the history behind that. So a big portion of Harvey's book is spent on unpacking these racial identity phases of stages of development. And I recommend her book highly, but I think we can give a brief summary of it here tonight. So the first stage is contact, which is described in most places as really more, it is kind of a colorblind situation where you don't necessarily know that race is an issue. And you move from that stage into the phase of disintegration when you have a life experience or talk to someone else, a person of color whose experience is different than yours, and suddenly you realize that maybe you've been taught or assumed that all people are equal, and then you are confronted with situations in which people are not treated equally. And that begins to disrupt your old patterns of thinking. and confronts your prior conceptions. So this can often lead to feelings of guilt and shame, because it's confusing and it's hard, and especially if you're a young person or young adult or child, to make sense of this is really challenging. So you can, and Carolyn was really helpful in helping me think about this, right? This is not a linear process. And this was me. I made this stage a different color because in my head earlier this week, I was like, ooh, this is the bad one. This is the stage we want to skip. Because if those feelings of guilt and shame about these new things that you're experiencing in life aren't channeled in a positive direction, then you can go into this reintegration stage where you begin to say, oh, well, it's a problem, but it's Black people's fault. If they would just listen to the police, there wouldn't be police violence, right? And we've all heard people say that and probably occasionally thought those things ourselves. But Carolyn helped me reframe this. It's not necessarily a bad thing, especially when you're thinking about sort of therapeutic settings, that development is a cycle, and we as humans can go back and revisit some things in order to move forward. So while it doesn't look good on the slide or on paper, it's probably something that we do all experience and can move through. And when we are able to talk about feelings of guilt and shame, that you can move toward this first positive stage of white identity recognition, which is called the pseudo-independent change stage. And that is, you're aware of racism, you're have a growing awareness that white is an identity, but in the pseudo-independent stage, you primarily are relying on people of color to show you what racism is and to tell you how it works, and to maybe help you understand, like, well, what should I do? I don't know. And we see on social media, especially in recent years, some of the pushback that this is a pretty big burden for Black folks and people of color to bear, to have to continually educate white people on what it is that needs to be done when they are dealing with sort of systemic racism, or maybe dealing with systemic issues on a more regular basis than we are aware of. So that's the pseudo-independent stage. Moving from that stage into immersion and immersion is that you have this recognition that something is wrong with society, and you're likely working with other white people to do the work of understanding your own identity and systems of injustice and oppression. That you're genuinely attempting to connect your identity and become anti-racist. Yep. Sorry, was there a question? Yep. And then, so it's not the final stage because this is a journey, right? But the autonomy stage is actively pursuing social justice, being actively anti-racist. And so this is sort of the ongoing work and the ongoing development of becoming anti-racist and doing that work, of which we are engaging in this evening. And when we think about raising white children, and as Carolyn mentioned, needing to understand how to help them develop healthy white identity, and that we have to do the research, we also have to do the work as adults ourselves. This isn't something that we can teach children without actively sort of engaging in that work ourselves. And here we are this evening having discussions of racism and anti-racism. So that is, that's just a brief overview of the stages, and I will pause here and see if there are any questions or comments about just those 5 different stages or phases before I begin to go on to the next part, where we'll connect sort of these stages and phases with our understanding of faith, is where we're headed. But any questions or comments at this point?
Christine, I'm just curious, does she address whether kids are able to go through these stages if they are in a totally white environment and have no access to children of color?
Right. So she does give a lot of really great examples of conversations she's had with her own children and other children she's been in contact with. One of the stories that she shares is that she, living near Ferguson, she did take her children to a peaceful protest there. And one of the things that her daughter said was, they'd had this conversation about, Michael Brown was killed and it had something to do with the color of his skin and it wasn't fair. So we're here to help people think about how to treat everyone fairly. And her daughter said out loud in the crowd, "Oh, I'm glad I'm white. I'm safe." And she talked about what an uncomfortable feeling that was to have her daughter say that. But then they were able to revisit that conversation and to talk about that, where I think a lot of parents, our first instinct is, oh my gosh, we can't talk about race out in public, and especially not at a peaceful protest. Like this is, So, she did tell her daughter, let's wait and get back in the car. So while she did actively take her daughter to a place where, to a different location, I think you could probably have these same conversations about news events or other things that kids are encountering. Jennifer Harvey makes the point that our kids are talking about race in school a lot, whether we know it or not, that they do have this understanding and they are incorporating it into their play. And so I don't know if I answered specifically the question you're asking, but she really does have some great conversations and examples for parents of white children.
Thank you.
Christine, I have a comment that I think, Christianity is a part of the culprit here in the sense that we were all taught from the beginning that we're all equal. And of course, we're all equal in the sight of God, but in reality, we're unequal in everything else. So, in other words, our Heavenly Parent sees all of us as his and her children, and that way we're equal. But very soon you learn that we're not equal. I mean, I can remember in the sandbox at Hubbard Wood School when John Heiser got up and says, "I want that toy." And he was bigger than I was. So he got the toy. Well, that was my beginning of saying, no, we're not all equal. And, it's that we all had these experiences in life. We were struggling with this idea, we're all equal. And life shows us that we're not equal. So it's just an observation.
No, and I think that speaks to that, that moving from contact to disintegration, right? That I think as young children, I don't know, maybe it's a natural inclination or maybe it's what we're taught, that we have this understanding, oh, we're all equal. And then we have a real life experience that shows us that reality might be different in the way people are actually treated. And how do we reconcile our belief with the realities of what we see? And I would imagine that many of us can remember those moments where we had those realizations that the world is not as we would wish it to be, that those can be very vivid memories that we have of when we first realized that things maybe weren't fair, either in our own experience or the experience of our friends. And John, go ahead.
I find it interesting, both her story about her kid and then like the two parts of the stages of racial development, like one that has to do with like being in interracial space, right? So like a white person talking with a black person and asking, how do white people help undo racism? And then there's this white space where conversations happen. And so, and then in her conversation with her daughter, she says, well, let's talk about this when we're maybe in white space, right? Or private space or whatever. So there's this kind of I don't know, I find that kind of distinction really, I don't know, it's really interesting, and I don't know, something to like, I don't know, just that I'm wrestling with a little bit about what all of that means.
Christine, if I just might interject, those experiences when I was young, I realize in hindsight led to feelings of altruism. In other words, anything that's we experience that, quote, is negative leads to our understanding of what the positive is. So it, good things come out of bad experiences, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right. I think that's where we find God's grace, is that ability for, good things to come out of bad situations. And sometimes that requires some hard work. Sometimes that requires some hard work, and
it's called pain. It's called pain.
It's called pain. And then, I think also dealing with that pain in a way that puts you on a positive trajectory. I will say I often, perhaps to a fault, quote Brene Brown, but she, has done a ton of research on guilt and shame. Katie's smiling because I talk about Brene Brown so much. But Brene Brown interviewed Ibram X. Kendi, who we talked about last week, and they talked a lot about how to deal with the feelings of guilt and shame that we feel when we realize that we're complicit in white systems of injustice. So there's a podcast about that, and I think it's a really helpful in thinking about that and how we move positively through that. And I'm glad that you brought up the faith piece, because that is where we are headed. So I think we have sometimes a paradoxical faith, and Harvey talks about the paradox of being both complicit and benefiting from the privileges of being white, but also having agency. And she uses an example of a moving walkway like they have at O'Hare, right? That we might be born as white people onto a walkway that is heading in a direction, and we can stand still on that walkway and we will be moving. White privilege will carry us forward, right? But that we do have the agency and ability to turn around and walk the other direction. And so it's a really interesting metaphor that she unpacks a lot in her book. But I think as people of faith, we have a rich understanding of paradox. And she brings that in. So what I would love to have a further discussion about is how we might think about these stages and how they apply to our anti-racist work at Children's Ministry. So this is a link to a Google Doc about scaffolding and anti-racist resources. It began circulating anew after the murder of George Floyd, and it uses the stages that we just went through and has resources for each stage. And if you're not familiar with the term scaffolding, it's an educational term where a teacher is providing the supports for a student to be able to do the task independently, but then those supports are gradually removed as the student becomes more and more independent, which is why I put this picture of, I think learning to ride a bicycle is an example of scaffolding. You start with training wheels and a parent helping you, and then, maybe you're doing just the training wheels, and then you take the training wheels off, and eventually then you are riding the bike on your own. So the anti-racist resources are really very interesting and something to look at. But as a church community, I wonder how we might think about what practical things can we do, knowing that there are people in our congregation in all of those stages, and it's not linear, and we're all moving forward and backward in a cyclical process. What are some of the concrete actions that we can take to continue to nurture healthy human racial identity development, not just kids? And so I'll give, go ahead.
Christine, can you put that link onto the chat? Because I can save the chat.
Yes, I can. Give me a moment and I will, yes,
Because
I will
I
do
can't,
that.
it doesn't, it's not a live link the way it is.
Right.
but
Yep. And I will, I'll do that right now. Thank you.
Sorry, I
That's a
didn't
good
mean
tip.
to interrupt the flow. But
Nope, you were fine. So I'm wondering about practical steps. So I'll begin with one idea I had that goes back to the beginning when Bill was talking about the images. If you Google Jesus, the images that you get are so many pictures of white Jesus. And then he showed the picture of, you know, what the scientists and historians have created as a possible more realistic depiction of Jesus as being a brown-skinned person from the Middle East. And so one of the things that I do in our children's ministry is that I really try to limit the number of images of white Jesus that we show in children's ministry and instead introduce more diverse, multicultural images of Jesus. So that might be something that we do as we're thinking about that de-integration phase where people are learning to realize that, oh, Jesus wasn't white. If you grow up only seeing white Jesus, that is sometimes surprising to people. And so that's sort of my first example of one small step that we might take as people of faith in our church to think about racial identity development. I'm wondering if others have some ideas.
Well, kudos to the staff there at Kenilworth Union, because I think this program has been really excellent, and various ministers have talked about racial issues in sermons, and I think, you know, bringing it to people's attention and talking about it is part of our research process. So thank you for the things you have already done.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here.
I think the beauty of Jesus' life on our planet is that he left no writings, no paintings of him, because, and obviously for his family, he wanted each of us to imagine him as we think he was, and we think he is. You know? So there's this beautiful church up in Nazareth that has, I can't remember the name of it, but it has this outdoor walkway, and they have representations of Mary and Jesus, which all Christian communities from around the world have submitted to be there. So the Japanese picture is Mary looks like a Japanese, Jesus looks like a Japanese, Africa, it's black, Polish, it's Polish. I mean, it's when I was there, that just struck me as the most beautiful representation of the reality. He is what he is, you know? And we all see him as us. Now the problem is that the Western European has sort of hijacked Christianity as their cultural icon, and so it makes it difficult for him to be appreciated by the rest of the world. You know? But I think Jesus as a black person is just as real as by seeing him as a white person, which I do not. But you know, it's a beautiful thing. Now, we're in a very challenging time because we're at the cusp of seeing our Creator Son as universal and seeing each other as brothers and sisters of the universal God. So,
Yeah. No, and thank you. And we've spoken a few times in these conversations about, you know, our Christian belief that all humans are made in the image of God, and yet we often have trouble living on a daily basis as if that were true, right? And maybe it's not a personal concern, but we have systems of power and ways of living in this world that don't always honor the sacredness of all human life. So yeah, thank you, John.
We had a little conversation about race and racism with 7th graders and up the other day. And one of the interesting things that I learned in that conversation is that there's a math teacher at New Trier who teaches, I don't know, maybe you would have had a unit like this in your math class where like you learn how to balance your checkbook, or you like math for everyday life, right? But she was teaching about like how like loans are like the math of how a compound loans are compounded or whatever. And so she taught the students at New Trier about how like the impact of, you know, somebody's grandparent being denied a housing loan in the, you know, 50s or 60s because of racism, and how that would impact their family wealth, and had them do the math on that. And I found it really interesting because you might think that a math teacher doesn't have power to have conversations about race with young people, but this math teacher decided, like, actually, I've got a lot of power to talk about race and to think about systemic injustice. So I don't know, I think that was a helpful conversation for me in terms of like figuring out how we translate that in children and youth ministry and at church, in terms of talking about kind of like maybe talking about the ways the church has been complicit in racial injustice, and as a, you know, highlighting that as a way of committing to figure out how we can be on the side of justice today.
Yeah, and I wonder how many, you know, on the one hand, it's sort of like, ooh, do we really want to teach kids about some of the church's, you know, the not great history of the church? And yet, if we don't, and then they encounter that later, that they have to go through this, you know, disintegration phase about the
Without
church,
us.
right? Yeah, without us. So how do we do that work well and carefully, so that they have, you know, that, because that's part of their faith development.
Right. No, and I think that sometimes in history class they learn about the ways that the church has been, you know, provoked violence or been part of on the wrong side of history, and then they feel betrayed by their church. So, yeah.
But I think that when we're talking about all of these things, they have to be put in the context of the time that they have, and not to excuse past behavior, but to understand that our standards are different today, and for the better, but not to condemn everybody that did something that was done, that was just not thought of as being a bad thing at the time it was done.
Right.
You know, to speak to that, Sally, I remember, like, my one big takeaway from American history my junior year in high school was that you have to judge a historical figure by the standards of their time. And in reading Harvey's book, she shares an example of when one of her daughters learned about George Washington in school. I think it was in like 1st or 2nd grade. And her daughter is just like singing George Washington's praises for like at least a solid month at home. And Jennifer is sitting there like, okay, what do I do? Because George Washington definitely had slaves. And so there was an ethics, there was something on the radio that her daughter overheard, and asked Jennifer Harvey about it. And basically it was that a politician had been cited with an ethics violation. And so Jennifer explained it to her daughter that one of our country's leaders in the government did something bad. And her daughter was just bowled over that a leader would do something bad. And she was like, has that happened before? What is this? And so Jennifer Harvey took that opportunity to explain, actually, like, that's not the first time this has happened. George Washington, who you learned about in school, well, he had slaves. He enslaved Black people and made them work for him. And the thing that she says here is that a lot of people do come up with that argument of like, but that's what everyone was doing at the time. And like, to a degree, that's true. And like, the Black people who were slaves at that time, they knew it was wrong. And there were other white people who knew it was wrong too. And they were the small minority, those working against slavery. But it wasn't like no one understood that it was a wrong thing, that it was morally unjust. And so it introduces a lot of complexity into how we have to think about and grapple with our history, especially as descendants of these white people who have done some pretty horrible things. And Jennifer Harvey really talks about it being, if we don't introduce this moral, ethical complexity to our youth, even from a fairly young age, we're really depriving them of the opportunity to grapple with this material in a deeper, more substantive way. So
Yeah,
I hope that provides some food for thought. I still haven't figured out exactly how to evaluate historical figures myself. I think it's got to be a both and, looking at them by the standards of their time and based on what we know now.
But it does seem to me, in some ways, you want to capture what's good in people. I mean, supposing Mozart has discovered that he was a dreadful man and he abused women and everything, are we going to throw away his music? I mean, people make great contributions, mm-hmm. and they're not perfect people. And so do we push the contribution aside? I don't know. I mean, I grapple with it too. I mean, I look at all this and think, I think we got to look at the way things were and the way things are and be glad that we've come where we've come. I'm sure we're doing things today that people will look back on someday and think, oh, they were dreadful people. And probably we are in one way or another. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to cope with all that.
Thank you, Sally. That was a wonderful observation, that we look back at our ancestors and we either chuckle or condemn. And I'm sure in the future, they're going to look back at us, sure, and laugh and condemn, or just say, be humorous. But the central core to me is, our Heavenly Parent loves us all. He gives us a brief 80 or 90 years on this planet before we graduate to the mansion worlds. We are resurrected and we continue our journey on the way to paradise. And, so this is we're all flawed, We have no idea what God's will is, but we can dedicate our consciously our will to do His will as best we can. But with all the billions of His children on this planet, they're not going to make good decisions. So we are confronted with this. So I look back at Washington, I look back at these people, and I'm saying, this was an economic system. This was a system that brought wealth to the colonists. Individuals didn't invent it; they were born into it. Now I don't feel comfortable going back and condemning them for the fact they were living in their time. Right now, I would say, to me, the sin of our institutions is, we think people should not have universal health care unless they can pay for it. That, to me, is is so un-Jesusonian. So, see, that would be my gripe. If I look at myself honestly, our culture really stinks as the way they treat each other on healthcare. So anyway, that's my rant.
No, I think that what the conversation is bringing to light is that these issues of race and history and current events are complex and nuanced, and we need to be able to think critically about the systems of power, and we need to be able to be open to new information and to be able to frame that information in our faith and our beliefs, right? And so one of the things that I am very passionate about in our children's ministry is helping kids to think critically about all of these things, not expecting them to just be handed a set of information and not think about how that applies throughout history and to their own lives today. And that critical thinking, I think, is deeply rooted in some of the pedagogies of liberation. There are a few that have emerged over the last 150 years out of the civil rights movement. We had Ella Baker and Education for Liberation in the Black community. And we had Paulo Freire in Central America, who was working with marginalized people there, and how learning is participatory and that learning leads to transformation. And then in Winnetka, we have, the remnants of Francis Parker, who, building on Dewey and the idea of progressive education, that we are learning things so that we can transform society. And while I never think of Sunday school as really being a school, we do have a lot in common, I think, with that ability or that need to help humans think critically, and especially with the lens of faith and church. So thank you all for bringing that complexity to light. I would like to end with a fun little story here and a picture. So can you see this little guy in the window? So this picture was taken at a church that I served, that because of renovation, they had to extend the depth of their stained glass windows so that it's a complicated story, but they had to extend the depth. And the way that they did that was to create a mirrored tunnel. And they were right at the height of a 5-year-old's head. And children delighted in putting their heads in here, and it was like just being inside of a kaleidoscope. And what I like to think, what I get from this, the metaphor that I take from this is, right, that we can catch a glimpse, we can imagine just a glimpse of what God's kingdom fully realized would look like, where all people are treated equally, truly, and the peace and the beauty and the justice that would emerge from that, right? That we have, that God has given us the gift to even just imagine a piece of that. And that God has also given us the ability to participate in that work, that we have agency. So just as this young boy has imagined that something beautiful awaits him inside this mirrored tunnel, he is participating by actually sticking his head in. And so, this work of anti-racism is hard, but my great hope is that participation will reveal wonders beyond our imagination and help us co-create God's kingdom where all people experience equality. So that is kind of my my ending with my cute little guy.